I realize is people are really, in general, looking at stories as a way of connection, as a way of really building and strengthening relationships, as a way of communicating. And even though maybe the way they do it doesn't follow the architecture of a story the way my brain does, I hold space for that to be a valid way that they approach this concept, as opposed to other ways of communicating and connecting and spending time together.
James Warren is the CEO and founder of Share More Stories, a human experience research company that combines storytelling and AI to develop unique insights.
And we were inspired deeply by a quote from Dr. Maya Angelou, which says, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." And so that became kind of the mantra, that we walk through life holding lots of stories that we really shouldn't hold in, either because they're difficult, kind of get better by letting them go, or because they're amazing, and life would be so much better if we all shared these amazing moments that we have with each other. If I hadn't been in that room and she hadn't asked that question and I hadn't answered it, we probably would have built something very, very different. I'm always grateful to this, as I call it, this customer that wasn't, because she really, really helped us figure something out in those moments.
That's beautiful. So many lessons for so many people out there. If people are hustling or wherever you are on your journey, just lean in when the opportunity arises. So James, welcome to the Experienced Designers.
Thank you so much, Steve. I'm really glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, look, I'm a very warm welcome. I'm super excited because you have such an interesting and unique perspective on some really interesting things that are very experience based. But in particular, I think where I'd definitely like to start is this word storytelling. Yeah. And let's unpack that from your perspective in terms of what that means. What has it meant to you, this word, so far in your life, and even into the work that you do as well?
That's a wonderful invitation. So thank you for that. I think it's nice to sort of take some time in, as you say, unpack that word, because it has come to mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And, sometimes the purist in me wants to say, what you're talking about is not storytelling. But what I realize is people are really, in general, looking at stories as a way of connection, as a way of really building and strengthening relationships, as a way of communicating. And even though maybe the way they do it doesn't follow the architecture of a story the way my brain does, I hold space for that to be a valid way that they approach this concept, as opposed to other ways of communicating and connecting and spending time together. But for me, when I think about stories and storytelling in general, I go back to being a kid. I go back to the times when my mom and my dad would literally bring me out in my pajamas in their cocktail parties and say, tell a story. I go by James, but back then I was Jimmy. So it'd be like, Jimmy, come tell a story. And there was something I had in me that loved the space, especially when we're talking about whether it's imaginative or relating true life experiences, that space to go deeper, to go inward and outward, sometimes at the same time. And in my professional life, what I've really realized is stories are, they're so deeply tied to the human experience. They're so deeply connective in terms of what makes us uniquely human and also what makes us human together. And so whether it's using stories in ancient times as ways of sharing and transmitting important knowledge, like, don't go over there, there's danger, or this is how we make this, you should try it this way, to much more modern times where I think stories are a foundational piece for us to really go back and say, hey, we're experiencing so much division, so much confusion all over the world in our personal relationships, at work, in the marketplace. What's a way we can start to approach each other differently? And in my experience, the story is the way, because I always say I can argue with your opinions all day long, but I can't argue with what happened to you. I can't argue with your experience. And so the story is a way that we can start to connect and learn from each other and listen to each other in ways that maybe we're not doing so much of in society today.
Yeah. And how has the form changed from your perspective over that time, from that small child with your parents all the way up to kind of today? How have you seen storytelling changing and evolving out there?
In my mind, the fundamental aspect of storytelling, or as I even say, story sharing, is the oral tradition. And actually, I don't think that's changed much at all. everything I see on social, in experiential, in person, in our everyday conversations, this very deeply human experience of orally telling other people what happened to us and how it made us feel and what we maybe learned from that, I don't think that's changed much at all. It definitely hasn't changed in my lifetime. And I don't think it's changed much in the human experience over, millennia. So I think a lot of what we're experiencing today are different mediums to access or to create or to share our stories. But even when we're whether we're writing or we're filmmaking or we're creating a brand immersion or we're doing organizational engagement, it all comes back to like this: two humans having a conversation about what happened and how it made them feel. Like nothing can replace that. Nothing can replace this moment when you're telling me what happened to you, because I do this, I lean in and I start to pay attention and something gets activated in me. And then when I play it back, the same thing happens usually in the other person. And so I think what we're experiencing now are coming up with more and more creative and technology enabled ways to make that fundamental experience maybe more widely acceptable. That's what we've been doing for the last 20, 50 years with different mediums and tech. But even right now in this moment, I think lots of folks are trying to figure out how do we make that connection, that engagement, that experience more easily replicable and scalable without losing the human essence of it. And I think that's a big challenge
Yeah.
for a lot of creators in the world today.
Yeah, and just to build on that as well, I think something that I've seen, which is really exciting as well, is this kind of this not just kind of storytelling, but this story living and story doing. We see Netflix House coming up in the US, you know, and I'm fascinated by the form because it's storytelling in the Netflix world is two dimensional. We're looking at a rectangular box and we're being enthralled by some form, and maybe Stranger Things for an example, which was an amazing TV series, amazing storytelling, and of course based in started in the 1980s, which is a great era anyway from a
Yes,
fashion perspective.
totally
Great,
agree.
great choice on that, wasn't it? But also like now the form, the way they're creating this kind of Netflix house where Stranger Things, now you can actually live that story, and the form is changing, and the way we engage and immerse ourselves in stories is also it's becoming more immersive and
Yeah,
becoming way more exploratory. Technology is playing a big part. What do you also see on that? Because I think there's just such an interesting time right now
yeah,
with this form and this way of which we're now engaging customers with so many different ways.
yeah. There's a group that's out of New York. I think it's called Future of Storytelling, FOST for short. And they've been for a while sort of convening these sort of tech forward, really bleeding edge, immersive storytellers. It's almost like a troupe of storytellers, a convening of folks across media, tech, brand, culture, and community, and really exploring all the ways that people are creating especially immersive experiences around story. And so, I relate what you're asking about, like, where do I see it going? I relate a lot of that to, say, the travel experience. I definitely see it happening more and more in retail, but I see travel as a space where it's story rich, it's experience rich, it's already inherently place based and immersive. And so, as travel brands and destinations really ask themselves, how do we not only attract more visitors, more guests, more travelers, how do we create a much deeper, more resonant experience for them that really activates, again, this fundamental human thing? When we experience a great story, whether it's ours or somebody else's, we tend to tell it. And so when a brand or a destination, particularly a travel space, can create that kind of moment, everything from, I almost liken it to like the red carpet treatment. What's happening as I'm walking up to the door? What's happening when I come into the space? What sights and sounds and scents do I experience? Have you thought really deeply about the colors and the patterns, all these things that sort of evoke or trigger or embed in my memory as part of the experience? That's what I'm really holding on to when I recall it 10 years later. People can remember really, really powerful things that happened to them with startling detail 20, 30 years later, because it really settled into their brain as a rich experience. I can't remember some of the things that happened to me this morning, but I can remember the amazing experiences I've had in places and
Yeah,
spaces. And if I
yeah,
if I zoom out, whether it was yesterday or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, probably one of the defining characteristics of it is it was immersive. Even before they called it that, it was immersive. It was multisensory, it was invitational, and it was participatory. And I think those are things that really create that opportunity for the consumer or the guest or the resident in a community to just feel it differently.
yeah. You know, as you're sharing that, sparked. I'll share this one with you because it really sparked a very recent one, but I know will stay with me. As I was in London for the London Experience Week, and we got to, as part of that summit, we got the opportunity to go on an experience safari around London, and so as part of that, we got to immerse ourselves and have kind of backstage tours of some of the most well-known experiences going on in London right now. And one of those was War of the Worlds, which from a storytelling one
Wow.
is an absolute classic. We didn't get to see all of it because they didn't want to spoil it, but it was fascinating. The entry moment when we walked in and through this door and entered the world from the ordinary world, there was we were immediately transported to a Victorian street which was damp, and as we were held in that space and they were discussing this particular space and how the story starts at this point, I just was taking a particular notice at the level of detail and even to the moss like embedded into the cobblestone in the
Yeah.
corner, and the lantern of this Victorian lantern, and even the smell was intentionally embedded, which was
Yes.
one of not flesh, but it was kind of like just it was pretty rank, but it was of an old Victorian street, which wasn't particularly clean back then. Hygiene wasn't of the highest order, so they just had it in that immediate moment, just captured this like moment of awe, like wow. And we hadn't even entered into the story at that point. So yeah, just sharing that because it was something which I will share again and again because it was such a poignant and interesting entry point.
You just I wish our CTO Andy was here because he would be really, really excited. When we ask people to share stories with us, we ask them to tell us about their senses. And under the sense of smell, we have a few different descriptors that they can choose. And some of them are earthen, woody, rancid,
It was in
musty.
that realm.
Right. And so,
For
they don't often get selected, but he would be really, really excited to hear somebody be like, I smelled a combination of rancid, earthy, and musty. He'd be like, yes, that's why
from the
they're there.
Victorian days.
So, but you're exactly right. I mean, these moments in our lives, these experiences that whether they're entertainment driven or curiosity driven or sometimes even painful, traumatic experiences, we often code them with our senses. We remember what happened and how it made us feel, partly because we're also remembering what we noticed about the moment because it was so profound. And that is
Yeah.
where the recall comes from. And that's what we're really searching for. And, some do it well and some do it, kind of at a surface level. But what I love about what you said, even using that example of War of the Worlds, I think just last weekend, sort of during this unplugged weekend I was telling you about before the show, um, somehow we wound up with this Smithsonian channel on, and they were going through sort of the decades, and they settled on a piece around War of the Worlds. And our younger kids perked up. They were like, "Wait, what do you mean there was a invasion?" And I was like, "Well, it wasn't. There was a radio show." They're like, "A what?" And they got enraptured watching these people sit around radio, immersed in real time at what was happening. And Orson Welles was such a masterful storyteller to be able to create back then what was the most immersive experience, captivating an entire nation at the same time, huddled around these, furniture sized radios, thinking that they were being invaded, but also processing it quite casually, having cigarettes and looking at each other like, what's happening? Are we being invaded or are we not? Like he had suspended disbelief so profoundly. He had
Yes.
created a moment that people could access that even watching that footage decades later, my kids were engrossed. They were like, how did that happen? How did he do that? Could somebody do that today? I was like, oh, that's a different conversation, kids. But
Oh
the
yeah.
idea that those types of stories really live on beyond the time they were told, beyond the medium in which they were conveyed, and to your exact point, they can be brought back to life with new and newer and different ways of giving people a chance to connect.
Absolutely. Well, just look at ABBA with the ABBA Voyager experience, brought back completely back to life in the
Yes,
sense of with holograms and stuff, which I
yes,
haven't been to the show. I've heard it's amazing. Um, so just tell me from your perspective in the work that you guys do, and we're going to dive definitely more into that because I'm really fascinated how how you're using storytelling for insights. But firstly, like just for this piece around storytelling for empathy and
yeah.
to generate insights and understanding. What's some of the journey that you've been on around that? And yeah, and I'm curious also how you've ended up doing that as well. Like, what's the journey into actually recognizing? Wait, hang on a minute, we can actually leverage storytelling for this.
Yeah.
Um, mm,
I've been there's two things I think I've wanted to be most of my life, as long as I could remember. One was a writer, specifically, probably storytelling more generally, although I never saw myself as an aspiring, say, filmmaker, but I always saw myself as a writer. And I also saw myself as an entrepreneur, more specifically a maker, a creator, a builder of things. And so those two things finally came together for me about 11 years ago. And when I started Share More Stories, I was really didn't know what I was doing on any level. I was very much like, I know it
good
has to
start.
involve stories, and I know it has to involve, building something.
Uh,
And my first real interest was even back in 2014. I felt like our social media was broken. And I said, we need a much better way for people to connect and engage. And we've all got lots and lots and lots of stories. We should just create a place where people can share stories. And I learned quickly a few things. I learned that building platforms like that requires lots of money, lots of expertise. But I also learned that people had, as much as everybody had sort of a story or multiple stories within them at any given time, we've sort of trained ourselves socially and culturally not to tell them as easily as we used to. So, like the fear of vulnerability, the fear of judgment, the fear of not being perfect, because of this broader environment of how content and communication and culture and media are consumed, fewer and fewer people see themselves as the not even the professional creators, just the expressors. Expressing themselves has become harder and harder for more people to do. And so that didn't actually turn us away. That made us more curious about, well, what did we have to do to create a place and space where people could feel more comfortable expressing themselves? And some of that was reflecting my own need and journey. I was desperate to express myself. I was desperate to feel heard and to be seen. And I called myself the frustrated writer for that very reason. But as we started playing around with it and building a site and building tools, we started learning, that what people were really interested in was not how to make this content or create this thing. They were really interested in exploring their own journey through stories. And so that was sort of the first kind of gem or nugget that said, okay, well, let's follow that breadcrumb and see where it takes us. And, I came out of the marketing and brand strategy world, and a lot of folks were like, this would be great for brands. And I was like, absolutely not. This is for this is not for brands. This is for people. And they're like, James, you know better than that. You know brands are people. And I was like, yeah, but and it took me a while because I really wanted to make sure we were building it in a uniquely person-centric, human-centric way, that I wasn't building just a brand engagement platform, that I was really building something for people to be able to express themselves. And so we said, this is about getting the story out of you. And we were inspired deeply by a quote from Dr. Maya Angelou, which says, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. And so that
mm,
became kind of the mantra, right? That we walk through life holding lots of stories that we really shouldn't hold in, either because they're difficult and we can kind of get better by letting them go, or because they're amazing and life would be so much better if we all shared these amazing moments that we have with each other. And so, back to that group I mentioned, Future of Storytelling, I was an early in my entrepreneurial journey, so I was hustling. I was trying to get to conferences. Hey, I can't afford that conference, but I can volunteer. And then hey, if you need a volunteer, are you giving away, tickets? And hey, it'd be great if I could get a night in that hotel. So I was really really hustling my way into these rooms with tons of world class leaders in, like I said, media, brand, etc. And so found myself hosting a workshop, which really meant being like the door host, the greeter. There was a speaker. Um, and in the room was a person at the time who was a director, senior director, VP of consumer insights at a large CPG, P&G. And she said something that just stuck me. She said, we're finding that we really need to find a deeper way to understand like what's really happening in people's lives. And a lot of the research tools we have aren't really giving us the whole story. And I mean, this was literally like one of those magic moments. And I was like, say something, James. And my inner critic was like, don't say anything.
No.
You don't know what you're talking about. You're in way over your head. And I was like, say something. So then I was like, that's what we're doing at Share More Stories. And, she was like, really? I'd love to talk to you about that. And I was like, me too. And then I was like, what did I just do? So we exchanged cards and we chatted, and I had learned enough to know, don't lead with what we're making, ask them questions. So I was like, what are you trying to do? And she said, we use this tool, we use that tool, but I just feel like there's something missing. Like we're missing the emotions. We're just not really getting the whole story. And I said, she goes, so what do you guys do? I said, well, we collect personal stories from people about their experiences. And she goes, that's interesting. How would I use that from a research standpoint? So again, my inner critic was like, well, the answer to that is we don't know because we haven't built that yet. But my little brave James voice was like, say we're measuring emotion. So I said that. I said, we're measuring emotion. And she's like, oh my God, I'd love to see more. And I was like, okay, great. Well, let's arrange some time where we can give you a demo. And she said, I'd love that. I called up the dev team and I was like, how do we measure the emotion in stories? And they were like, don't know. But we found some tools and we made some things that allowed us to do it. And she came to see the platform and she brought all this insight, and we built things based around her needs and use case. The challenge, the most hilarious part about that story is she left the company before we could finalize the work. And so they never became a customer, but she was the best customer that wasn't, because she gave me courage. She gave us a clear use case, a clear problem to solve. And really, she put us on this path. If I hadn't been in that room and she hadn't asked that question, I hadn't answered it, we probably would have built something very, very different. And so I'm always grateful to this, as I call it, this customer that wasn't, because she really, really helped us figure something out in those moments.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So many lessons for so many people out there. If people are hustling or wherever you are in your journey, just lean in when the opportunity arises. Say yes, and then run around like a headless chicken after. It's all
Absolutely.
good. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a lesson in there as well. We're all winging it. Everybody is winging it. Don't ever forget that. Not everyone has all of their stuff sorted out. We're all in the same boat for sure. Can I just ask as well, because I've been involved with some survey work previously, and I actually, similar to you, I actually did build an insights tool specifically at the time in the candidate experience insights
Yeah.
element, and I know how difficult it is, and capturing any kind of like customer, employee, whatever, fan, member experience, it's tricky. And asking just typical survey questions, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, it's always challenging, isn't it? Because it sometimes they feel like a bit of a bolt on at the end of something, or they're kind of ill conceived, and the questions just don't feel quite aligned at all and kind of miss the mark, or they're asking questions they want to hear on. And I think that's a really important one, is this kind of like, yeah, from our perspective, this is what we want to hear from you, rather than let's give the agency to you to share what your experience was and let's derive insight from that perspective. What's your what's your take on that? And also, like, from stories, how is that different?
Yes.
For just for the audience to understand that.
Well, you've hit on a really, really key point here, which is exactly as you say. So much of what takes place in, say, consumer research today, even employee research, is predicated deeply and almost exclusively on what that client, i.e., leader, not just wants to know, but already believes to be true.
Hmm.
There's very little, we say exploratory, but very little is exploratory. Much of it is confirmatory. Like, I think this is
Yes.
true. I'd like to validate that.
Yes.
And because people in large organizations that are hierarchically driven have a deep seated motivation to maintain the status quo. Even if they want to grow, growth is incremental in most of these companies because markets are complex, changing consumer behavior is hard, and innovating is really hard. And so I believe that lots of people in these companies subconsciously sort of suboptimize that to say, well, yes, even their innovation, which feels innovative, is really very incremental. And that feels like a big risk. So I don't blame people who approach it that way, but we also have to name it as what the situation is because there's plenty of things people want to tell us if we would make space for them to do so. And if we only give them our, 50 question survey with a little open-ended box at the end, never mind how seriously they take that survey, they're probably not feeling like this is my chance to be heard. And even in our focus groups, when we have a preconceived idea of what we want to ask and what we hope people will tell us, you got 5 or 6 or 8 people in that group. Even with the best moderators, you're really only hearing from any one of them maybe 5 to 10% of the whole time. And so there's still gaps in what people are expressing to us as insights, as experiences that we can learn from. So what we're trying to do, what we are doing with Share More Stories, is flipping that script and saying, really, the opportunity is to create a place for people to tell us deeply, emotionally, and from their perspective, what's happening, how it makes them feel, and why it's important. And then we have to figure out how to make sense out of that. That puts the onus on the listener, but that's true in a one-on-one conversation. If I really want to learn from you, I can't put to you, "Hey, I'd love to know about your experience, but if you would do it in a way that just answers these 5 questions, I would really appreciate it." If I did that to you, you'd be like, "Thanks, but no thanks, James. I'm out." Because who,
Or the classic is, how likely are you to recommend
I
me
mean,
to friends or family?
I
Sorry,
if I
I'm
get
being critical,
another,
but yeah.
after an interaction, rate this 5 point or 10 point scale, or like, you know, there's lots to say about those. And like I try to tell people, different tools have reasons for being, and most of them can do some good. The problem is when we over rely on them to do things that they're really not designed to do. And when I think about, surveys, most quant and a lot of qual is they do a good job of answering who, what, when, and where, and sometimes the how, but they don't really answer the why. And they're not designed to, because the why can't really be boxed in the way we think about it in surveys and even in a lot of our qualitative. The why has to come from the person you're seeking to engage and to get insight from. So the story is a place where you can invite them to do that, where you could say, tell me a story about a time when, and make that story, the prompt is somewhat reflective of what you want to know. The difference is you're willing to consider and entertain a wide range of experiences to find out what you need to learn about them. And so it really is an engagement driven mindset that says, I want to engage you in order to understand you. And then based on what I understand about you, I can start to better meet your needs and your wants and your preferences. But I think that's the shift that we're talking about. So when you ask people to share a personal story, all those things I talked about that we learned at the beginning, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of judgment, the fear of loss of privacy, all those things are very real. And you have to help them navigate that so that they feel comfortable enough to tell you what you really need to know, not just what you want to hear.
Yeah. How do you? There's two thoughts to build on this. Is the prompting to coerce the story from that individual,
Yeah.
and how that's kind of enticed. And then the other element to that then is, once you've captured enough stories, how are you then creating the insight from that? And is there a particular like model to that or framework, or how does that work? I'm
Yeah.
really curious because just that prompt question you had, like, tell me a time when. It's that's a super open question, and really it's a super inviting one.
Yeah.
So, and we all love to share those stories. So I think it's a great way of capturing insight. So just share with those two ends. Two ends.
No, it's a great question. You just encapsulated what we call this learning roadmap, right? What is it that we really do hope to learn, and what do you really hope to do with what you've learned? And so that learning roadmap is almost a prompting exercise with the brand or the organization or the leader to say, what are you trying to solve for in the business or in the organization? That's question one. Now, what do you think is missing in what actually know to do that? Because we operate with lots of like basic knowledge and then lots of shared knowledge. But if there's a gap, if you're like, hey, I wish we could do this. Okay, well, why aren't you doing it? Well, because we aren't doing this. But let's drill down. Why aren't you doing that? Well, so you don't know X that you need to know in order to make that okay, great. So that's what you need to know. Now we've done this a lot. So we say, well, what's a way to ask people to tell us about relevant experiences they've had that help you learn what you need to know? And so the way to do that in general, as you point out, is we start with an open and invitational crafted prompt. Think about a time or tell us about a time when dot, dot, dot. And that dot, dot, dot is usually followed by something related to the core of the experience that we're trying to learn more about. So it could either be foundational insights where we're trying to understand how people feel about the brand. Maybe it's a new brand, or you're going into a new segment, or you're repositioning. So kind of getting a newer foundational understanding of what are people really engaging with in this brand. That's one example. Or it could be more, you know, we're in the middle of executing this strategy, but we're struggling. So let's unpack this aspect of the product experience or this aspect of how we go to market. And some of that is in identifying, well, who would you ask to tell those stories? And so that's where, just like in research, just like in marketing, we're identifying the who. And when you put those three things together, what we want to learn, who we're asking it from, and a prompt to get them to open up, then that's what happens. And so they will share those stories in surprisingly rich and deep ways. We focus in this research a lot on written storytelling. We're doing audio now. We're adding audio, and we'll explore video at some point in the future. But right now, we're doing a lot of written storytelling because it allows us to explore their experiences in without that fear of judgment. So often when they're talking to a camera, they worry about, how do I look? And you know, even when they're doing audio, how do I sound? But when they're writing, they can naturally clarify, edit, etc. And so when they do that, then they write those stories in a platform. Sometimes they're writing hundreds, sometimes even like 1,000 words about an experience with the brand or the company or the product. And that gives us a tremendous amount of insight. And so when we have those stories on the back end, we're looking at the stories, we're looking at how we analyze those stories for emotions, we're looking at some very basic questions they answer about who they are or what they do. And all of that together gives us a really, really rich view of that individual, at least in the context of that experience with the company or the brand. And then that's when the analysis starts.
Mm. And you mentioned earlier, I mean, from an emotion point of view and even sensory as well, how do you pack in those kind of um, those elements into the analysis?
So what we're doing in our platform is we started doing this back in like 2016, initially going way back to that story I told you when that person at P&G said, I'm looking for a solution. We made one. We found some tools that were really, really early in AI and doing much more than just basic sentiment analysis, but we're looking at personality and values and needs. And we started testing those and playing with those. And then IBM bought those tools and added them to their Watson suite. And we became part of IBM's global entrepreneur program. So we got access to a lot of these tools and we started building with them. And what we learned is we could code for values, needs, core emotions, personality traits, and personality facets. And each of those things is being measured against the text of the story, or in our case, more specifically, we break that text down into smaller and smaller segments so we can get a more accurate view of what exactly are people feeling. Because we're more than just one moment in an experience. There might be things that are both happy and sad. There might be two different moments that I'm experiencing very differently in the same broad experience. I might say, I hated getting to this hotel. I hated the check-in process, but man, I loved my room. And so each of those moments is different, and they all relate to that travel experience, because what we try to help brands and organizations understand is, you know, the experience that people are having with you is not always only dictated by the things you can control. And so it doesn't mean you can solve for their trip to the hotel. But if you're mindful of that and you're aware of that, you might make that welcome extra special, as a sense of relief. Now you're here. Now you're in the place you're supposed to be, because we now know how much that matters to you. We know there's a part of your experience that you don't love, and we can't do anything about it, but we can do a lot about your experience once you get here. And when people have that insight and they have the intention of making a better experience, then that's when good things start to happen.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good example. I mean, what's in your sphere of influence is there, right? So to, like, have that as your focus area. But if you have an understanding of where somebody's coming from, that's a nice example.
Yes.
Um, can I just ask as well, because I think it was something we discussed pre-show, but I'm really curious because this is something that we definitely we hit on, which was around the CX and EX intersection. So this kind of, you know, I don't know, let's hypothesize for a moment.
Yes.
Like AI right now is obviously accelerating. And my view is, for brands and organizations, the moments of interaction, like human interaction between employee and customer employee, are going to amp up, and the need is going to be even greater for as a differentiator. I really believe that, and that's both in anything from learning and bringing your team together now in some kind of offsite experience to actually in store in a retail context, and how we maybe think about the future of retail. What's your view on that, and this kind of intersection from storytelling from both sides?
Yeah.
The employee story, what's their story while they're working in an organization? Or in fact, what's their human story?
Yeah.
And how is that also impacting and contributing to their experience and what they're then delivering for the customer? And then the customer human experience also coming together. It's quite, when we think of it like that, like two human experiences coming together, how are these stories feeding that insight or opportunities?
Well, and I think we're big into AI ourselves, because we're using AI to drive the analytics of the platform, and it's been that way for some time. It Because we're doing it with a fundamental human truth, a person's story. It gives us maybe the luxury of being able to at least hold for now this human and digital space together. And I think that is also what has made us more sensitive to how to listen and lean in to what's happening in that human experience on both sides of that brand or organizational relationship, inside the organization or in the marketplace. And so, you know, to answer your question, I would say it's partly inherent in your question, right? What is the relationship between the employee and the customer? And the answer is, it's profound. And the degree to which you don't think you have those things have a relationship is probably the degree to which both of those experiences are suffering. Because any place an organization has to deliver any part of its value through people, and and people will assume that means retail, hospitality. Well, even if you're a tech company,
Yeah.
increasingly, the more complicated our products are, the more I find that we are leveraging either, human designed agents, in some cases, thankfully, still humans providing customer support and success, especially in B2B, you're often dealing with humans. Even if it's a human at the second line of intervention and support, humans are either delivering or they're building the things that deliver the value to your customer. And if they don't understand their own experiences, if you don't understand them, and if they don't understand the customer experiences, you just have a lot of fragmentation in your value delivery. You might have great leadership, you might have a great employee experience, you might have a good brand and a good customer experience, but if they're not connected, you're missing opportunities. And that's assuming you think about those things and you try to make them better. You just the lack of connection can lead to suboptimal results. And so,
Huge.
in the most literal sense, what we've seen is, for example, in one project we're working on, the health and wellness space, we see that when employees experience and feel a high level of trust in and around their work, it leads to, or at least correlates, I should say, with a high level of trust in the customer experience. And in this case, in health and wellness, that interaction between the human and the customer or the patient or the member is really, really important. But we also see that that high level of trust in both employee and customer also correlates with a higher level of joy and a sense of achievement in the customer. So we're starting to map what people have maybe known intuitively in some ways, like, yeah, happy customers make happy happy employees make happy customers. But sometimes I think people feel that's just like folksy and anecdotal. And when they have to make hard decisions, they cut resources and programs that maybe make that true. Now we're showing it in data. We're showing the in the same organization, looking at employees and customers at the same time and asking them to describe their experiences of feeling connected to or supported by that organization. They're giving us two sides of the trust coin. And they're also showing us what happens when they don't feel trusted or trusting in the environment. It's the exact same pattern between the employee and the customer, the exact same distribution curve, which was eye opening. And when you see it that clearly, you know that you are showing people this story is not one sided. There are two sides to this story. If we want to drive value, it is not skipping the employee and hoping that we have the brand and the price and the promotion and the distribution and so on right for the customer. It is through the employee. And it's not just through the employee as we have to tolerate you to deliver value. It is we have to invest in you because A, you're a human and you deserve that kind of experience. But the more we pour into you, the more you're going to pour into the customer. And we see it time and again in our work.
What else do you see in the stories? I'm really curious to have you got any kind of anecdotes or not necessarily examples, but maybe some like themes that would you could share for the audience around. Hey, listen, we listened to 1,000 stories,
Yeah.
and here's some nuances I think you should be aware of.
You,
Yeah,
you love it. It is it's the best part of my job, Steve. Like
yeah,
I don't have, we're much bigger than we were when we started, where we would do these sessions all live in workshop form. They'd all be, you know, 15 to 20 people at a time. And even then I felt like deeply privileged and honored to be able to listen to these stories of people who would our process made them feel comfortable. They would open up, they would get curious about themselves and they would share. And there'd be this moment in these workshops where we'd done our whole facilitation and we're like, all right, it's time to write. And I would always feel like a little bit of anxiety, like, what if they don't follow this journey? And they'd all just like look around and then put their head down and this quiet would descend in the room. And what I realized then was like, that was another moment, like people were connecting with themselves. It was cathartic. It was therapeutic. And we started also hearing from some of those early customers like, this is great, but I need to talk to more than 20 or 30 people. Can you build this out? So we started building this platform. And when we launched the platform, I had again that same like real deep pit in my stomach, like, what if this doesn't work? And what if they don't express themselves the way they do in the rooms? And they almost went deeper because they didn't have to worry about what people around them might be thinking, and they didn't have to worry about like writing on a clock in the workshop. And so they would start, leave, come back. And so then we were like, this is interesting. Like we're actually seeing a different approach to the ask of sharing their story. And they started the emotions I saw becoming more intensified or clearer to read. And one of the things that really, really jumped out at us was, especially in the employee experiences, there's even in some of the best run companies, um, people are struggling. Even when things are generally good, the in so much of corporate culture where we're saying things like, we want people to be more empowered, we want people to make decisions, we want people to be more accountable, but they're such hierarchical organizations that that shift, that journey is not really underway in most of them. Like, I think sometimes those boardrooms and leadership teams think it is, and then you talk to their people and they're like, I'm just doing this. It's like that old there's a Marshawn Lynch NFL moment when he was with the Seattle Seahawks where um, he showed up to a press conference. He's like, I'm just here so I don't get fined. And sometimes that's how some employees, even when they're getting like great results, great ratings, they are just showing up. They don't feel deeply connected to the work in some cases the way that I think their leaders think they are. And so when we hear these stories of like the conflict between, I feel like I can achieve a lot, I also don't feel like I belong here. Like that is like, I want to know
Wow.
that. And if I'm a leader, I should want to know that. And I should want to do something about that because if I'm getting good results with a person who's motivated to achieve but doesn't feel that they belong, what kind of results could we get if they also felt like they belonged? If they felt really seen and heard, not just for their achievement, but for just their being there. So we have, I would say, over the last 3 years, the tenor of especially employee stories started to shift to something deeper. And we talk a lot about belonging in the world, and we talk about it a lot, especially in this country. But I feel like we were getting an early view into what belonging actually meant for people, and we say it in some of our community, like it's not a program, it really is an emotional state of being. And if you don't know what that emotional map is, it's very hard to deliver that sense of belonging. We can do it one-on-one, but we're doing it one-on-one because we've actually consciously and subconsciously spent time getting to know the person that we want to create that space for. If you're going to do that with a team, you got to get to know the team. If you're going to do that with a company, you got to create a way that you can get to know the company at scale. So that's what I mean when I say this stuff is like empathy at scale. It's creating a way for people to tell you what they really feel about their experiences. And they're trusting that you're going to do something with it. They're trusting that you're going to make it better for them because of that. I think that's a
Yeah,
huge opportunity for
it
companies
is.
everywhere to go much
It
deeper
is.
into that employee
Mm.
experience.
And also as well, how this is really cool. And I tell you, this is just some immediate feedback and thought reflection back to you. Is how many times though, if we have a story to tell or share, we tend to do it, and this is very generic, but just what I'm thinking with this is that we tend to share it in maybe a social context or with a friend or a family or just, and it tends to be in a certain context, and they go, yeah, I had that as well, and da, 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 da. But how often do we actually sit down and reflect on that story?
Yeah.
And I think intentionally, I don't sit down and reflect on a customer experience story or a brand experience, sit down in that context. And I think there's something really powerful about that, about the greatest learning does come from reflection.
Yes.
And so I think it's also a really clever way to reinforce the brand for that person to relive and talk that story through in a reflective way, with the know that that will bring further value or will hopefully contribute to something, to make things even better, or just better. um yeah, there's something cool about that. I like it.
It's about voice, and perspective, and making space as a brand manager or a product manager or an executive, a team leader, whatever role of leadership that person has. There's a responsibility in that leadership, and I think the greatest responsibility is to deliver the results for the business or organization, whether that's for profit, not for profit, whatever that you're there to do, and to do that by impact, by increasing the impact. You can't increase impact. It's not a mathematical formula. It's a human one. It is a human experience to feel and make impact. Impact means something changed in me. So when that consumer goes from transactionally having a relationship with the brand to that moment where they've fallen in love and they will tell everybody they know about it, that was an impact. That was brand impact. But the same thing happens in the organization. That time when, you know, the leadership could have made the easier decision that was less expensive and maybe less risky, but they would have put some of their team in a vulnerable position, and they said, we're not going to do that. That's when those employees were like, now I know you got my back. That's when that trust goes up. And so that's an impact moment. That's not just I did this and they did that. That is something in me changed, even if a little bit. And so I think, you know, when I have a moment to reflect on that, it can maybe strengthen maybe my conviction or my resolve to deliver that kind of moment more consistently, more intentionally, to design for it, to say, hey, I'm glad that happened, but it kind of happened not by accident, but maybe only by intention instead of also by design. And so, and those
Yeah.
two things are different in my mind. We can intend lots, but if we don't put effort to design around that intention, then we are just hoping that what we want comes to be. And I think that in the organization and in the brand, we have to turn that intention into design, and then we have to build it out. And so that's where the real work happens, I think, in the organization and in the brand, is to say, we now better know what kind of moments we can have. Let's make more of those moments for the people in our charge, because look what happens when they experience those moments. They love working here, they love the brand, and they love interacting together. Some of the employee stories we hear are these delightful experiences of working with customers, unprompted. We're asking them about their employee experience, and they're saying, so like when I get to do this with this group or with this customer, that blows me away. That tells me that there's more folks out there who, if you give them the space and time to really make an impact, the more of them than not want to. We've just beaten it
Mm,
out of some of them.
absolutely. There's an example in the UK. I'm going back a few years now, so I'm not going to share exactly because I might share my age, but it was a mobile phone company, and I think it was like a SIM only type product initially. And they, at the time, O2 was the biggest, like the best customer experience in the UK at that time. They were like the one that everybody was kind of going for because they were delivering extremely good high level quality customer experience. And this company came along, and it was tiny. I mean, it was like a SIM only business, and they they not only caught up with O2, I think they even beat them to this customer experience award, if memory serves me right. And I got to meet the customer service director, and I asked the question like, how did you do it? And it was ridiculously easy. They just said it was really easy. We just removed the scripts, and we removed average handling time targets, and we gave agency to the agents to deliver good customer experience. And that was pretty much
That's awesome.
not. That wasn't only it,
Yeah.
but it was a big component of. Zappos being a great example of that in the US, where the agency was like, do what needs to be done to
Yeah.
support the customer, remove those control mechanisms, remove those metrics that are there to spend less time with the customer, and let you be human and help other humans. And I think there's something really powerful in that.
I love that. And I think, you know, for the leadership team that's struggling to do that, I would ask them in the most literal sense, you know, what are you afraid what happened? Because oftentimes, like, fear governs so many of our decisions. And it's like, what are you trying to avoid? What are you trying to mitigate? And get them to unpack it, because then you might get to a place of, well, what they're really saying is they don't trust their team. Okay, why don't you trust your team? Is it you haven't given yourself enough occasions to observe what they would do? Okay, because you could create those moments and see, you could start this journey. Is it you don't think you've hired the right people to do it? That's hard, but you might have to face that. Or is it that you have the right people and they have the right capability, but you're afraid of losing control? Because control is a powerful motivator in these hierarchical structured
Could be.
organizations. You know, if I give up control, what value do I have? If I'm not telling people what to do, what is my role? And what we hear sometimes, you know, sometimes people will say, we want to understand what the customer is doing and feeling and experiencing. Great. Customers basically telling us, like, we'd like to have this experience. You're like, well, that's really a staff issue then. Yep, you're right. Let's move upstream. Let's explore what's happening in the organization that's making it hard for customers to have the moments that they want, that you want them to have. Oh, well, the organization's telling us this is really a leadership issue. Yep, you're right. So let's move upstream. And now you're at a point where you've come full circle, where the leaders not only got to put themselves in a place of listening, your earlier word, they've got to put themselves in a place of self reflection. What do I need to do differently if I want to truly have this kind of deeply customer centric culture, this brand that delivers incredible and amazing experiences and achieve the business outcomes that I want? That's leadership. So sometimes we have to help people get there gradually, because if we start by saying you're not going to get any of those outcomes until you change, they're like, I'll look for an easier path. And sometimes when if they're at least willing to listen, then we know there's an opening. And that opening is about reflection, like you said. It's listening, it's engaging. And then it's just gradually bringing them to a point of realization. The customer experience is dependent on the employee experience, and the employee experience is dependent on your leadership. So if we want to change the outcome, we've got to start doing some work here. And usually by that point, they're open to that and they're willing, but it's hard. It's hard to get
It
people
is
to that place.
systemic.
Well, the difference in the marketplace, right? That's why there's
Yeah,
winners and losers, because
always,
some bet on that
always.
strategy and some don't.
Yep. And James, there's an area, a final area I want to explore with you, because it was just part of the research that we've undertaken, but also I know this is something which is close to your heart and something which I know you really lean into, which is around belonging, inclusion, community. How is the work that you've been doing with Share More Stories kind of inform that and support that kind of that these topics for you?
Um, Increasingly, in my personal view of this is to see these things with less distinct boxes and more fuzzy edges. The work I do through Share More Stories with our team, my personal sort of practice of writing and exploring my own life and journey with as much vulnerability and courage as I can muster. I'm doing that not only because it's helpful for me, I think it's helpful for others when they tell me that. And then, the work I do in the community, I see those as very much overlapping spaces. And in the middle of it is my sense of my purpose and my calling. And I didn't realize this until about 5 years ago. And I was working with a coach, and, we're exploring all of my life experiences, my frustrations, my pain points, my aspirations, and, you know, a lot of storytelling. And as I recalled, the moments that sort of kept stacking together were these moments where I experienced or others experienced profound hope, and also where things were being like really revealed, like, oh, like insight, like, oh, that's really what's happening. And so it's like, that's why I'm here, for people to experience hope and revelation. And it sounds very grandiose, and I don't mean it that way. I mean it in the most
Not
literal sense. That's why I believe I'm here. So in the community, I'm leveraging some of the same techniques and tools that I've learned or we've honed at Share More Stories. Sometimes we're even leveraging the Seek platform that we built with communities and organizations, because we're all parts of this community too. And so wherever we can help make an impact, make a positive difference, we want to do that. Because I think, globally, definitely in our countries and in our cities, I think lots of people are experiencing a connection crisis, a belonging crisis, beyond the obvious of global conflicts and you know differences in resources and all the
goes
things that
deeper.
have been part of the
Mm.
human experience as long as we've been around. I actually think the dramatic increase in technology over the past, say, 30 years has made people has given people more activities to do, but have left us often feeling less connected, even when we are doing things digitally in similar spaces, because, to your point, we may be shortening that up. It may be a shallower experience. It may not be as rich and as deep as it used to be. And I'm not saying we need to go back to a time where we don't have those tools. I'm not even saying like every tool's got to change its reason for being. I'm saying we as humans can reclaim some of our own experience. We can say, hey, I'm meant to be interdependent with other people, neither wholly dependent on them nor independent of anyone. I'm meant to be interdependent. So what does that look like in our team? How can we build that experience? What does it look like in my neighborhood? What does that look like in our community? What does it look like in our country, in our world, to build real interdependence? I think so much of belonging depends on healthy interdependence, where I feel seen, I feel recognized and remembered when I literally and physically enter and re-enter a space. The act of saying, of greeting somebody by name is one of the most powerful indicators of belonging. When you acknowledge people's names, people instantly feel safer. They feel, oh, okay, I'm in a place where somebody, anybody knows me. And that reduces the amount of fear and uncertainty as to, is very primal. Like, what might happen to me if nobody knows me? I could get left behind. I could get forgotten. That happens in work. That happens in society. And so when somebody says, oh, I know you, the uncertainty goes from this to this. And then if somebody says, hey, come with me, it goes from this to this. And so for me, like creating those moments and spaces everywhere and anywhere, inside the organization, in the brand, in the community, in my own life, in my family, in my neighborhood, that's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow. Thank you for that. Thanks for sharing that, James. That's really powerful. Um, yeah, I'm just thinking of share more stories in the context of community, local community, elderly groups, different, different demographic. I mean, just yeah, imagine. It's really powerful, really powerful.
Some of the most delightful and melancholy is a good word for this. We've done some work with older populations, with aging populations around like the caregiving experience. And those stories are, they make you feel like what those people are experiencing, what they love and what they really are saddened by, what they are. And it's not always what's happening in the moment with a caregiver or a caretaker, it's what they've lost. And so if you really, as a micro example, if you're really trying to help an aging adult feel better about the fact that they're aging, it's not just in the functionality of the caregiving experience. It's in both helping them adjust to an unavoidable loss of maybe freedom or independence. It's also creating new moments where they can have a sense of, here's an interdependent moment where you can be you, where you can show up. They are craving those experiences. We tend to relegate our older folks as well. They're aging. They're not really showing up as themselves anymore. No, they have some of the most fascinating personalities and just want to be engaged and want to be connected. And when you give them space to do that, the functionality is still there, but the functionality takes a big second backseat to the connection that they're longing for, like all of us.
Yeah, yeah, agree. James, um, you know, sometimes you have an inkling on podcasts. You go, "Oh, this is going to be a good one. This is a nice one." So, you know what? Thank you for taking us on a story and a journey today. Because I think
Thank
we
you.
started with storytelling. We've gone into data, capturing stories, a bit more in the business, and then I think we've evolved it way more into the human as we've closed off this podcast. So it's been a really nice journey to share this with you. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. A true experienced designer, and I hope it brings some value to the listeners, and perhaps also, if anything, I would wish certainly for this one is for people maybe to bring their awareness to stories, their story,
Yes.
others people's stories, and what insights can you derive, or learnings or reflections. I think that's something that I'm definitely going to take from this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate it. Thanks for letting me be part of it with you.
Thank you.